He came into the conversation full of confidence, ready to win. He had done this many times before, arguing, debating, challenging believers, especially Muslims. He thought he had heard it all, that no answer could surprise him. To him, religion was just tradition, culture, maybe even fear. He had read a few articles, memorized a few arguments, and sharpened his tone for one purpose: to prove that faith was blind and that logic always wins. His goal wasn't to understand, it was to shake someone's belief, to make them hesitate, to make them stumble. And then he met a Muslim unlike anyone he had debated before. This Muslim wasn't defensive, he didn't interrupt, he didn't quote verses in anger or argue to defeat. He simply listened, smiled gently, and answered with sincerity. The more the man tried to provoke, the calmer the Muslim became. There was no sign of fear in him, no insecurity, just a quiet strength that seemed to come from somewhere deep. It was unsettling. The man had been expecting resistance, maybe even anger, but this peaceful confidence, it threw him off. Still, he pushed forward. "Why do you believe in something you can't see?" he asked with a smirk. "Why follow a religion that tells you what to do every day of your life?" He thought these were hard-hitting questions. He thought he was scoring points. But then the Muslim paused, looked him in the eyes, and said just one word: "Love." That was it. No lecture, no long-winded explanation, just that one word. And it shattered everything. Love? He hadn't expected that. He thought Muslims followed Islam out of duty, out of tradition, maybe even fear. But love? It wasn't just the word, it was the way it was said. With peace, with truth, with something he couldn't describe. It pierced through the walls he had built around his heart. He went silent. His mind was racing. That one word opened questions he had never dared to ask. Love. Of what? Love of who? Love for rules? Or was there something deeper, something spiritual, eternal, beautiful? He didn't admit it at the time, but in that moment, he wasn't the one in control anymore. That Muslim, with one simple word, had turned the entire conversation upside down. And for the first time, he wasn't thinking about how to win the argument. He was thinking about what he had missed all his life. He walked away that day without another word, but inside something had changed. He didn't want to fight anymore. He wanted to understand. Because that one word had reached where no argument ever could. And now the question wasn't, why do Muslims believe? The real question was, what kind of love gives someone that much peace, even when challenged? That's when the journey began. He had spent years watching videos, reading forums, and following debates where people challenged religion, especially Islam. To him, it was just another belief system among many. He didn't hate Muslims, but he couldn't understand how anyone in the modern world could still follow religion so seriously. He saw it as restrictive, outdated, and emotionally driven. One day, he joined an open discussion online where Muslims were talking about their faith. He didn't join to learn, he joined to challenge. He threw out question after question, some thoughtful, others intentionally sarcastic. He asked about prayer, about hijab, about rules, about God, and most of all, about evidence. What proof do you have? He kept repeating. Most people tried to answer him logically, quoting scholars, sharing lectures. He brushed it all off as emotional and unscientific. But one man replied to him differently. He didn't argue, he just said, "I follow Islam because of love." That one word stopped everything. It wasn't what he expected. Not law, not fear, not tradition. Love? He paused, unsure how to even respond. Love of what? He asked. The man replied, "Love of Allah, who created me. Love of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, who lived with mercy. Love of the Quran, which gives my soul peace. Love of truth, even when it's hard. Something about the simplicity of the answer struck him. He had been expecting a long debate, but instead, he was handed something he hadn't prepared for. Something pure. And it began to make him uncomfortable. Not because it was wrong, but because it was real. It wasn't just belief, it was connection. He started reading more that night, quietly, privately, not to challenge anymore, but to understand. And the more he read, the more he saw that Islam wasn't just a system, it was a relationship, a way of loving the Creator by living with purpose, a way of finding peace not in winning arguments, but in surrendering ego. That night, he cried for the first time in years, not because he lost a debate, but because he had finally heard something true. One word had done what 1,000 arguments could not. It had reached his heart. The moment the questions began, the air changed. He was sharp, quick, and confident. He asked about everything: God, prayer, fasting, women's rights, even the idea of worship itself. Isn't Islam just about control, he asked? Why would a loving God ask people to suffer or sacrifice? He wasn't trying to insult anyone, but he was pressing hard, clearly trying to expose what he thought were flaws. Most Muslims in the room answered with verses and explanations, trying to show him the wisdom behind the rulings, but with every reply, he only nodded with a half smile, ready with the next challenge. To him, it was all theory. Ideas passed down, followed blindly. He believed that religion, especially Islam, was based more on culture than on reason. And so he kept pushing, not to understand, but to win. But the Muslim he was focused on didn't respond like the others. Instead of quoting books or arguing details, he simply listened. His replies were calm, grounded, and filled with something that wasn't logic, but it wasn't weakness either. It was depth. When asked why he believed in Islam, the man smiled and said, "Because the truth doesn't need to shout." That reply, so simple yet strong, caught the challenger off guard. He wasn't used to believers being so still in the face of pressure. And yet, here was someone whose faith didn't shake. When asked why he submitted to rules and rituals, the Muslim said, "Because I trust the one who gave them." Again, no anger, no shouting, just peace. Slowly, something began to change. The questions no longer had the same energy. The challenger wasn't getting the reactions he expected. Instead, he was being shown a version of Islam he hadn't prepared for, one that wasn't based on fear or habit, but on deep trust and quiet conviction. That realization began to unsettle him. He had brought arguments, but this Muslim had brought truth, not through debate, but through presence. After that moment, something inside him felt different. He had asked questions his whole life, some out of curiosity, many out of pride, but now, for the first time, he had heard an answer that didn't come from a textbook or a YouTube lecture. It came from the heart. One simple word: love. Had done more damage to his doubt than any long debate. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real, and that made it powerful. He kept thinking about it after the conversation ended. What kind of love was this that gave a person so much calm, so much conviction? He had always believed that faith was built on fear, that religion only survived because people were afraid to think for themselves. But this love was different. It was chosen. It was deep. It was not desperate. It was dignified. And that thought refused to leave him alone. He started watching videos, not to refute Islam, but to explore it. He searched not for faults, but for feelings. And again, he saw the same thing. Muslims who found peace, even in hardship. People who smiled while praying. People who cried, not out of pain, but out of connection to their Lord. He saw converts talk about how their hearts felt full for the first time. He read about the Prophet Muhammad, how he forgave enemies, fed the poor, and cried for his people in the dark of night. It wasn't weakness. It was the strongest kind of love, the love that gives without asking anything in return. And slowly, the cold wall in his heart began to melt. He wasn't ready to change everything yet, but something had definitely changed inside. The religion he once challenged now made him reflect. The Muslim he tried to corner had opened a door, and the word he once mocked, love, had become a seed planted deep in his soul. Now it was growing, quietly, strongly, and he knew something was calling him back. As days passed, he couldn't ignore the shift happening inside him. That conversation, which he once thought would be just another intellectual exercise, had become a turning point. The word love kept echoing in his thoughts, not because it was new, but because it came from a place he had never explored: spiritual sincerity. He thought about how the Muslim he spoke to didn't try to impress or overpower him. He didn't even defend Islam aggressively. He simply reflected peace and certainty. That was what made it so impactful. It wasn't the words, it was the soul behind them. He remembered how calmly the man spoke, how his eyes didn't flinch, and how his tone never rose in anger. That kind of strength didn't come from being right, it came from being rooted in truth. And now, every time he thought of Islam, he didn't think of rules or restrictions. He thought of that man's faith, that calm, that heart. He started noticing things he hadn't paid attention to before. The call to prayer no longer sounded foreign, it felt like a call home. The word Allah didn't feel distant, it started to feel comforting. He would see Muslims in public, praying quietly and peacefully, and instead of feeling confusion or judgment, he felt something strange: respect. There was a beauty in their submission, a grace in their discipline. It wasn't robotic, it was heartfelt. He realized he had spent so long looking at Islam from the outside, like staring through a glass window. But now, for the first time, he had stepped into the warmth behind that glass. It wasn't cold, it wasn't forced, it was full of meaning. And deep down, he started to feel like he was the one who had been missing out. That single word had broken something inside him, but not in a painful way. It had broken the wall he had built around his soul. And in the quiet of those nights, he began to whisper things he never imagined he would say. God, if you are real, show me what this is. I think I want to know you. And the journey continued. He never thought he would find himself feeling this way. A man who once prided himself on rational thinking and skepticism was now moved by something he couldn't fully explain. He wasn't looking for religion, he had come to disprove it. But now he found himself drawn to the very thing he tried to tear down. That one conversation, that one word, had opened a door inside him that logic had kept shut for years. He thought about the Muslim man often, not because of how much he knew, but because of how deeply he believed. It was a type of faith he had never encountered before. Not defensive, not proud, just deeply rooted, honest, and calm. That kind of faith couldn't be faked, and that made it impossible to ignore. It stirred something in him, something that felt like longing, not for proof, but for peace. He began exploring Islam quietly. He didn't tell anyone. He wasn't ready for that. But deep in the night, he would read translations of the Quran. He would watch videos of converts, scholars, and stories of the Prophet Muhammad. The more he learned, the more he realized how wrong he had been. Islam wasn't a religion of blind obedience. It was a path of light, connection, and love. It called the soul to return to its creator, not through fear, but through awareness, through mercy, through gratitude. He came across verses that touched parts of his heart he didn't even know were still alive. He read stories of people who had nothing but still had faith. He saw a way of life where even a smile was an act of charity. And he started to see what the Muslim man meant when he said love. This was not about just following rituals. It was about living with purpose. Every act, every prayer, every word carried meaning. He used to think Muslims were restricted, but now he saw how they were actually free. Free from ego, free from confusion, free from the noise of the world. And in that freedom, he found something he had been searching for all along: truth that spoke to the heart before the mind. There came a moment where silence spoke louder than words. He was sitting alone late at night, reflecting on everything he had experienced over the past few weeks. The debate that began with ego had ended in something he never anticipated: humility. The man who once thought Islam was just about rules now saw it as a path filled with beauty, patience, and sincere love. He remembered how it all started with a challenge, a test he thought he would win, but instead that challenge led him to the very truth he had been running from. He felt something heavy inside him, not the weight of defeat, but the realization that his heart had been starving. For years he had fed his mind but ignored his soul. And now that his soul was awakening, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: peace. A strange, calm peace that came not from having all the answers, but from finally asking the right questions. He found himself whispering things to God in the darkness. He wasn't sure if it was prayer, he wasn't even sure what to say, but it felt honest. "If you are real, guide me," he said one night. "If Islam is true, open my heart to it." And deep inside, he knew something was already happening. He had seen the way Muslims lived, not perfectly, but with purpose. He had heard the Quran, not as poetry, but as guidance. He had seen faith, not as weakness, but as strength. He no longer saw submission to God as a loss of freedom, but as the very definition of freedom. And that realization changed everything. His tears were no longer from confusion, they were from clarity, from healing, from hope. He remembered the Muslim man who had answered his question with a single word: love. That word didn't win a debate, it won a heart. It didn't crush his arguments. It softened his soul. And now, the man who had once tried to break a Muslim's faith was discovering faith of his own. Quietly, slowly, sincerely. And maybe, just maybe, that was the answer he had been chasing all along. In the end, what started as a challenge turned into a transformation. One man walked into a conversation with the goal of tearing down someone else's belief, but he walked away with a crack in his own heart, a crack where truth, light, and faith quietly entered. He wasn't defeated by arguments or overwhelmed by emotion. He was moved by sincerity, by one word, by love. A love that didn't scream or demand, but stood firm and gentle in the face of confrontation. The Muslim man didn't try to win a debate. He simply reflected the calm that comes from knowing Allah, from trusting His plan, from loving His prophet. That kind of strength doesn't come from books. It comes from the heart. And that heart had reached another, in a way no logic or debate ever could. It reminded us all that the best dawah doesn't always come from speech. It comes from character, from patience, from living Islam with beauty. So if you're watching this and wondering what the point of your presence is, remember this story. You don't have to be a scholar. You don't have to have all the answers. Sometimes just your calm reply, your sincere faith, your quiet love for Allah can change someone's life. That man didn't change because he lost a debate. He changed because he saw Islam in action. And that's the most powerful proof of all. May Allah guide the hearts of those who are searching, and may He make us among those who reflect His light with humility. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone. You never know whose journey might begin with your message. Thank you for watching, for feeling, and for being part of this journey. May your heart always stay connected to the one who created it.